This is East Asia Tonight.
Good evening, I'm Natalie Edwards. Tonight's top stories. Amid a fragile ceasefire, President Trump confirms U.S. forces will stay put near Iran until a real deal is secured, as China urges all sides to seize this chance for peace. Now, the fallout from the war continues to ripple across East Asia. Japan weighing a fresh release of oil reserves, South Korea doubling down on diplomacy to bring crew and vessels home, and Hong Kong preparing for relief as fuel costs surge. China's top envoy, Wang Yi, is in North Korea on a two-day visit, his first since 2019, in a sign of Beijing's push to deepen ties and step up strategic coordination. And Pyongyang says it has tested new military tech, including electromagnetic systems and a missile carrying a cluster warhead, ahead of joint air drills between Seoul and Washington tomorrow.
Go!
Ahead on the bulletin, trail running hitting its stride in China, drawing in seasoned athletes and casual enthusiasts. As the new season begins, we find out what keeps them coming back for more. A two-week ceasefire to de-escalate tensions in the Middle East already under strain, with Iran accusing the U.S. and Israel of breaching multiple terms of the newly brokered truce. But China, meanwhile, is reiterating calls for peace.
我们希望有关方面能够抓住和平的机会，通过对话协商弥合分歧，推动海湾和中东地区早日恢复和平稳定。
Pakistan has stepped up security in capital Islamabad ahead of peace talks between U.S. and Iran this weekend. Both sides have confirmed their participation, although reports are emerging over a potential delay in arrival from the Iranian side. On Saturday's talks mark the first time warring parties are directly negotiating in nearly 50 years. Tehran is expected to push its 10-point plan for ending the war. Now, the possibility of a breakthrough, though, remains uncertain. U.S. President Donald Trump says that Washington will keep its military forces deployed around Iran until a real agreement is reached. Mr. Trump also insists that Tehran will not be allowed to obtain nuclear weapons and that the Strait of Hormuz will remain open. A temporary resumption in shipping activities backed by Iran. The Islamic Republic has announced alternative routes for vessels transiting the waterway. State media say Iran's Revolutionary Guards Navy is urging ships to proceed with caution due to possible sea mines. Meanwhile, Israel's military says it has killed Ali Yusuf Harshi, personal secretary to Hezbollah chief Naim Qassem in the Lebanese capital Beirut. Harshi was known to be a close associate and personal advisor. Now, over in Lebanon, a national day of mourning has been declared to honor victims of yesterday's Israeli strikes, which killed more than 250 people. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has vowed to keep hitting the Iran-backed group wherever necessary. Now, the IDF has said that operations against Hezbollah will continue with great force, despite mounting backlash from the European Union and United Kingdom. China, meantime, is urging restraint, saying Lebanon's sovereignty should not be violated. And for more on China's role in the ongoing ceasefire, we will be speaking with Dr. Jing Lin, a research fellow from the Middle East Institute at NUS, a little later this hour. Japan is looking to release more oil from its reserves as uncertainties persist over the reopening of the Strait of Hormuz. Well, that's according to a report by Kyodo News. The government is weighing a release of about 20 days' worth of stockpiles as early as next month. The country is highly dependent on the Middle East for about 95% of its oil. It first tapped on its reserves in mid-March in a coordinated move with other countries. If the latest planned release takes place, Japan will have made available 50 days' worth of oil. Now, Japan's reserves are sufficient to sustain the country for about 230 days. Well, the prolonged uncertainty also prompting South Korean President Lee Jae-myung to call for the deployment of all diplomatic resources to ensure the safe return of South Korean vessels and crew. Currently, 26 vessels with more than 170 sailors remain stranded at the waterway. The government adds that it is working to ensure a stable supply of daily necessities. It earlier dispatched a special envoy to secure oil supplies. Hong Kong, meanwhile, is set to roll out short-term subsidies as well as fee waivers to help ease pressures on its transport sector that's now grappling with oil price fluctuations. According to the South China Morning Post, a task force will be set up to oversee its introduction. China's top diplomat Wang Yi has arrived in Pyongyang for a 2-day visit at the invitation of North Korea's foreign ministry. Well, the trip by the Chinese foreign minister signals a renewed push by the two countries to strengthen ties that appeared to have slowed since the COVID-19 pandemic. Well, Mr. Wang was welcomed by his North Korean counterpart as the two are expected to hold talks. Yonhap News Agency reported that the top Chinese diplomat is also likely to pay a courtesy call to North Korean leader Kim Jong-un. China's foreign ministry said that the visit is an important move to advance bilateral ties. Earlier this month, China restarted direct flights between Beijing and Pyongyang after a 6-year pause due to the pandemic. Passenger train services between the two capitals have also resumed last month. Well, Mr. Wang last traveled to the country in 2019, which followed reciprocal visits by both countries' leaders earlier that year. It also comes ahead of a planned trip by U.S. President Donald Trump to Beijing next month. For more, we are joined now by CNA's correspondent Tan Si-Hui, reporting to us live from Beijing. Si-Hui, first up, help us understand, what is Wang Yi aiming or trying to achieve with this visit to Pyongyang?
Well, definitely top of the agenda is repairing bilateral ties and shows that China wants this relationship with North Korea to remain crucial. And this follows a period of stalled exchanges due to the COVID-19 pandemic, as well as complications in a relationship, especially with North Korea's deepening relationship with Russia since the start of the Russia-Ukraine war. And so Chinese Foreign Affairs Ministry said that they hope that this visit would strengthen strategic communication, enhance exchanges and cooperation, as well as advance relations. And just fresh out of the press conference earlier today, the spokesperson said that they hope that both sides can discuss areas of common concern. And analysts are saying that one of the key focus is definitely the economic cooperation, especially since China is North Korea's most important trading partner, with China accounting for about 90% of North Korea's foreign trade. And in a sign of warming ties, we saw trade between both countries go up by 22% year on year in the first 2 months of this year. And this comes just as direct flights have resumed just last week between both countries. Train services also restored for the first time in 6 years just last month. As to whether North Korea will reopen further, that's difficult to say, but analysts say that there are some indications.
The ball is very much in the North Korean court. But at least in terms of commodities, now it may be possible because of the rail and air links. And the air links may also make it possible for example, some form of selected tourism to take place. But again, this would depend very much on the comfort level of the North Korean side as to how they want to shape tourism and trade potential moving forward. And also, it also depends on any potential possibility of talks or summits with President Trump.
Also, Sue, I'm curious to know how Wang Yi's North Korean visit is going to factor into China's broader diplomacy, especially when there is this possible Trump-Xi summit that's happening mid-next month. Could the Iran conflict somehow reshape Beijing's coordination with Pyongyang ahead of such talks?
I mean, that is the question on everybody's minds. But this North Korea visit isn't happening in isolation. In fact, it is part of China's broader strategy to align its regional players before any potential high-level diplomacy. And so it is engaging North Korea, which is one of its rare allies, and it wants to engage and ensure that there is security in the Korean Peninsula before any major talks with the U.S. And this is also happening amid the war in Iran. And so this gives increasing urgency for China to play its role as a diplomatic broker, with Mr. Wang Yi already making 26 calls to different parties. And I spoke with analysts that say that with the announcement of the recent ceasefire, this will give positive momentum to what could possibly be a meeting between Chinese President Xi Jinping as well as U.S. President Donald Trump next month.
Bearing in mind that in Northeast Asia, the political culture depends a lot on symbolism. It's a high context political culture. So this could add some kind of positivity for the Trump-Xi summit to take place, and then perhaps messages passed during closed-door sessions. Again, conjectures because of the unique opaque political system and perhaps the scripted format of such meetings in Northeast Asia.
Well, analysts are saying there could be also the wheels in motion for a possible Trump-Kim summit, which is Mr. Kim, the supreme leader of North Korea. After all, Mr. Trump says that he has a great relationship with Mr. Kim and he is open to a face-to-face chat. And so this North Korea visit could really be laying the groundwork for that possible re-engagement.
And many thanks for that update. CNA correspondent Han Se-hui speaking to us live from Beijing. Well, North Korea says that it has tested multiple military technologies this week, including an electromagnetic weapon system and a ballistic missile fitted with a cluster bomb warhead. Well, that's after South Korea said that it detected back-to-back missile launches from the north. It said one of the missiles flew about 700 kilometers into the East Sea, also known as the Sea of Japan, before landing outside Japan's exclusive economic zone. The state media KCNA identified one of the weapons as a surface-to-surface missile, Hwasong-11 Ka. It said that the test demonstrated its ability to reduce any target to ashes. The combat reliability of a mobile short-range anti-aircraft missile system was also tested. Now, Japan condemned the launches, accusing North Korea of violating UN Security Council resolutions and endangering Japanese citizens. Well, meanwhile, South Korea says that it will begin large-scale joint air drills with the United States tomorrow, and they're aimed at strengthening combat readiness and coordination between the two allies. Well, the two-week drills, called Freedom Flag, will take place at an air base in the southwestern city of Gwangju. They will include training in defensive counter-air operations, air interdiction, and close air support. Seoul will deploy a range of aircraft, along with surveillance, transport, and refueling of planes. Now, Washington will also contribute a variety of fighter jets, surveillance aircraft, and drones. This year's exercise will be led by South Korea, as it looks to take over wartime operational command from Washington by 2030. Military officials say the drills will also test how fourth and fifth generation fighter jets can operate together, reflecting the changing demands of modern warfare. Well, short break is up next, but coming up on East Asia tonight, oil prices rise again as doubts over a fragile ceasefire raise concerns that energy flows through Hormuz will remain restricted. Plus, a deep dive into the private credit industry as it faces a major stress test with billions in withdrawals and rising concerns over risky software-linked loans. Hello there, good to have your company on East Asia tonight. It is now time for your business news with Roland Lim, and it looks like it's another roller coaster day for markets, apparently over concerns of a fragile ceasefire.
Yes, Asian markets fell, oil prices on the rise again. Now, traders concerned about the durability of the two-week truce in the Middle East, and only a handful of ships have transited the Strait of Hormuz following the ceasefire. Let's check in on the Asian markets. Nikkei 225 ending the day 0.7% lower. In Seoul, the Kospi benchmark is down 1.61%. It's also downward sentiment in Greater China. Second Bourse Shenzhen component down a third of 1%. Hang Seng Index in Hong Kong was off by 0.5% in the red. Oil markets resuming gains after yesterday's sharp declines as continued Middle East clashes threaten to derail the fragile ceasefire between the US and Iran. Both Brent and the West Texas Intermediate higher after Tehran accuses Washington of violating their agreement. Strait of Hormuz remains largely blocked. Only a handful of vessels have managed to leave the region, according to data compiled by Bloomberg and Marine Traffic. For now, Iran Press TV says the vital oil route is fully closed, even though safe passage through the narrow waterway was set as a condition of the two-week truce.
The ceasefire has happened, but there hasn't necessarily been a lot of movement on ships yet through the Strait of Hormuz. So keep in mind, while I'm optimistic, I'm cautiously optimistic. This ceasefire could collapse again as parties start to negotiate in Islamabad. There certainly could be more friction that does reemerge in the days ahead, and that could send oil prices swinging right back to the upside.
Now, 2 Chinese tankers fully laden with oil are on track to becoming the first such vessels to exit the Persian Gulf. Ship tracking data showing that the Cos Pearl Lake, as well as the Ronghai or the He Ronghai, is heading towards the Strait of Hormuz at full speed. Both very large crude carriers signaling Chinese ownership on their tracking systems, a move which is usually done for safety ahead of Iran-approved transits. However, a successful crossing is not yet guaranteed due to conflicting messages on the strait's opening. Japan's Mitsui O.S.K., one of the world's largest shipping companies, says it's poring over details of the ceasefire before allowing its vessels to pass through the strait. An LNG ship, partly owned by Mitsui, had passed through the strait last week, the first time a vessel with Japanese ties successfully making it through the waterway. Meantime, Japan is considering a new release of about 20 days' worth of oil reserves as early as May, amid uncertainty over the reopening of the strait. The International Monetary Fund is warning that many emerging markets are now more exposed to sudden global shocks because they are relying much more on fast-moving foreign investors like hedge funds and mutual funds. The concerns comes after a sharp sell-off linked to the Iran war, with March seeing the biggest monthly outflow from emerging market assets since 2020. In its latest analysis, the IMF says emerging markets have attracted far more foreign money over the past 2 decades, but much more of it now comes from non-bank investors who can pull out quickly when markets turn nervous. Now, that matters because when the fear rises, countries can be hit twice, when money leaves and when borrowing costs jump. The IMF says hedge funds are among the quickest to cut exposure when volatility spikes. And there is fresh evidence of that pressure. According to data from the Institute of International Finance, investors pulled more than $70 billion from emerging market assets in March. That's the biggest monthly outflow since the COVID market shock, as the Iran war hurt confidence and sent oil prices surging. The Bank of England has also warned that heavy hedge fund activity can make bond markets more fragile and allow stress to spread more quickly across countries. Private credit faces its biggest test yet. According to the Financial Times, wealthy individuals pulled out $20 billion from major players like Apollo, Ares, and Blackstone in the first quarter. The rush reflects growing anxiety about loans to private equity-backed software companies. Now, here's a lowdown on how private credit works and why the boom may be revealing early signs of strain. JP Morgan chair Jamie Dimon had a stark warning about the private credit boom. When you see one cockroach, there are probably more. Now that fear is hanging over a market that promised investors high returns and regulators a safer alternative to bank risk. Private credit is lending outside traditional banks, where companies borrow directly from private funds. Now, it's backed by money from pension funds, insurers, endowments, and increasingly wealthy individuals. Over the past 2 decades, the biggest private equity houses have moved well beyond buying and selling companies. They've become major lenders too, and they've become massive. Apollo, Blackstone, Carlyle, and KKR together managing some $3 trillion worth of assets, and that's up from roughly $900 billion nearly a decade ago. Here's how it works. Investors put money into a fund. That fund lends to companies. Those borrowers pay higher interest. But many of these loans do not trade openly in public, like public bonds. So prices are harder to verify. Valuations are often based on models rather than constant market trading. And outsiders get much less visibility into what's actually sitting on those books.
Private credit has not been tested in terms of, since it's really grown to be such a big part of our markets. Really all it saw was COVID, and COVID was such a short and period, and so much, Fed intervention, liquidity thrown into the mix. So I think you do have to worry about the underwriting standards.
At first, investors were rattled by concentration risk. Now, nearly a third of some private credit loan exposure was tied to software firms, just as AI is starting to disrupt parts of that sector. Now, investors are also alarmed by something even simpler. Everyone else seems to be worried too. Now, many of these funds typically only allow up to 5% of holdings to be withdrawn each quarter. If redemption requests go higher, managers exercise their right to enforce the cap or try to satisfy more investors, putting the fund under greater strain. And that creates a dangerous loop. Now, investors think the loans are overvalued. They rush to get out early. Then it becomes harder for managers to convince the markets those assets are really worth what they say they are. But here's the crucial thing. Private credit funds failing will not bring down the entire financial system. This is not the 2008 financial crisis all over again. Private credit is simpler. It's less leveraged than mortgage-backed securities behind that crisis and unwinds more gradually. But that doesn't mean there's nothing to worry about. The biggest concern is insurers. Now, some have invested in debt linked to corporate buyouts, and in some cases, they are now more closely tied to the private market firms arranging those deals. So this may not be another global financial crisis, but it could still become a slow squeeze on the wider economy. When a fast-growing market built on hard-to-test valuation starts to lose their trust, well, the damage could spread. Tighter credit, higher borrowing costs, weaker investment, and more pressure on the real economy. This comes at a time when companies are already dealing with war, energy shocks, and uncertainty. The future of travel could also soon be paperless. Now, new global trials show passengers can move through airports using digital identity stored on their phones, with biometrics replacing repeated document checks. Tests across Europe and the Asia-Pacific also prove that different systems can work together seamlessly. Willie Walsh, Director General of IATA, told CNA's Yasmin Yonkers what this means for the future of travel.
Yeah, I think this is a very important development. We've tried to set out to prove that with the existing technology, we can actually facilitate contactless travel. So we've proven interoperability between different systems. The technology is there. There is demand for this sort of service from both the airlines and from customers. And what we need to do now is get governments and regulators to buy into this and facilitate it and make the customer experience at the airport even more, enjoyable, if you like, than it has been. And technology is going to facilitate that. So, you get great examples when you travel the world about how challenging it is, the number of times you have to show your ID, the number of times you're checking paper and people are looking at your passport or your ID. To be able to just travel through the airport, having done all of that in advance, without having to demonstrate, your physical passport, I think will be a fantastic development.
IATA is getting IT providers on board to work closely with airlines and airports to transform legacy systems. Outside of contactless, what are the other priorities for the industry?
Yeah, this is really a huge pain point for airlines. You know, we have legacy systems embedded in our organizations. In many cases, they're so complex, we're afraid to untangle them because we don't know what will happen if we disconnect one part of it.
Can you give an example of that, Mr.
Well, you know, I'll give a personal example of when I was in Aer Lingus. The reservation system that Aer Lingus introduced in 1968 is still in operation today. You know, an IBM mainframe computer. Now, it's extremely efficient. It's very cheap, as you can imagine. It's been there for almost 60 years. It does an awful lot, but over the years, requirements have changed, and you know, making changes to these legacy systems becomes very difficult and very expensive. And therefore, you know, what we need modularity. We need to be able to add new modules and systems without having to redesign the whole legacy system that we have. So getting from where we are to where we want to be is going to be a challenge. It will be a painful and expensive transition. But what we've got to do is ensure that for the future, we're not locking ourselves into a single form of technology, if you like, that we'll have options to add or subtract you know, parts of the system that we use without the complexity that we face today.
As aviation becomes more data-driven, the challenge is keeping pace with the risks that come with it. The question now is whether the industry can stay ahead or risk being caught off guard. Yasmin Yonkers, CNA, Singapore.
But time now for another break. But coming up on East Asia tonight, China urges warring parties to seize a chance at peace, a day after U.S. President Donald Trump suggested Beijing helped to bring Iran to the negotiating table. Is China truly emerging as a credible broker in this crisis? Well, we'll be getting insights after this break when we speak with Dr. Jing Lin, a research fellow from the Middle East Institute at National University of Singapore. And the leader of Taiwan's opposition, Kuo Mintang, calling for peace amid rising cross-strait tensions. You're watching East Asia tonight, and here are the headlines we're following. Amid a fragile ceasefire, President Trump confirms U.S. forces will stay put near Iran until a real deal is secured, as China urges all sides to seize this chance for peace. The fallout from the war continues to ripple across East Asia. Japan weighing a fresh release of oil reserves, South Korea doubling down on diplomacy to bring crew and vessels home, and Hong Kong preparing relief as fuel costs surge. And China's top envoy, Wang Yi, is in North Korea on a two-day visit, his first since 2019, in a sign of Beijing's push to deepen ties and step up strategic cooperation. China has urged all parties to seize the chance at peace and bring stability to the Middle East after the U.S. and Iran accepted a two-week pause to the conflict. Now, China's foreign ministry added that it will continue working to ease tensions and end the crisis. And that comes after U.S. President Donald Trump said yesterday that Beijing played a role in bringing Tehran to the negotiating table. The fragile ceasefire is largely holding. President Trump vows to retain military assets in the region until a peace deal with Iran is finalized. And Tehran is hoping that China could be one of the security guarantors in the Middle East. Now, for more insights, we are joined now by Dr. Jing Lin, a research fellow from Middle East Institute at the National University of Singapore. Well, Dr. Jing Lin, thanks so much for joining us this evening. Well, let's just start with China's role so far. Well, Wang Yi has reportedly, held more than 20 phone calls. So help us understand how much has China actually helped to shape this moment? We're talking about the fragile ceasefire right now, and just how significant is it?
Well, I think the most accurate way to describe China's role is behind-the-scenes facilitator and a facilitator with leverage. And from what we know, the immediate mediation channel was actually Pakistan, and China was not the public face for these negotiations. But China played a supporting role to provide political backing, to encourage restraint. And it is reported that China actually pressed Iran to show flexibility. And Beijing was the backstage pressure point, used its leverage as Iran's largest trading partner, and actually buys over 80% of Iran's oil. So to urge Tehran to show flexibility and agree to this 2-week ceasefire. So we can say that China is a facilitator with leverage. And it's also important to note that around 18 March, when the conflict entered a more dangerous phase with strikes expanding to energy infrastructure and led to wider regional spillover. At that point, China visibly intensified its diplomatic engagement. Foreign Minister Wang Yi was in near daily contact with regional counterparts through calls and meetings. That shows a more proactive but still low-profile effort to stabilize the situation.
So yeah, I hear what you're saying about China basically being behind the scenes, a facilitator, and also because they have strong willed economic, prowess with Iran. But help us also understand, just going forward, the question of how much of this influence really goes, because Beijing's biggest contribution already behind us, would you say, or do you think China could matter more in the next phase as negotiations begin this weekend?
Well, I think Beijing's influence or leverage is real, but indirect. Beijing, as I mentioned, that Beijing is Iran's largest economic partner and a crucial energy customer. So it has structural influence over Tehran's strategic calculations. At the same time, China also has strong motive to stabilize the situation, especially to ensure the reopening of the Strait of Hormuz and avoid the disruptions to global energy flows and supply chains. So we can see that China is playing these two sides diplomatic engagements. On one hand, China joined Russia to veto a US-backed resolution on the Strait of Hormuz. It is publicly siding with Iran, but privately, China's Foreign Minister Wang Yi was on the phone constantly. And so I feel like before the actual talks happening Friday, China is likely to play a back-channel supporting role to encourage both sides to stay at the table and to avoid escalation.
So, Dr. Chinglin, I hear about this structural influence, that you are saying about China here. Yeah, but just moving on to as well, to touch on the limits of Chinese influence at the same time, right, in a conflict like this.
Yeah, I'm going to talk about the limits. So we can see that China wants to build its image as responsible global power and force of stability. But in this case, its credibility is specific to Iran. And the reaction across the region, especially in parts of the Gulf, has been far more skeptical. And China's decision to ally with Russia in vetoing the UN resolution has left some regional actors quite uneasy. So we can see that China has clear limits, and especially because it lacks leverage over Israel. And in the Middle East, it works, of course, it holds over Israel. So it has very little leverage over Israel and lacks the military capacity or willingness to enforce outcomes on the ground. So we are seeing it's a very different model that China is active diplomatically and economically, but
I just want
avoids
to
hard
talk about the U.S.-China dynamic here.
Commitments.
Yeah, the U.S.-China dynamic here, because how far is China's handling of this war shaped by its broader goal of trying to keep U.S.-China ties stable through this crisis and also ahead of the possible meeting between Mr. Xi and Trump?
Okay. I think it actually stabilized the atmosphere of the summit, the meeting with Trump, but complicates the substance. So the good news is that, of course, the ceasefire removed the immediate obstacle that forced Trump to cancel the trip last month. It allows them to meet without missiles drones flying. However, China sees this war as the U.S. bogging itself down. It is a war that should never ever happen, and war may strengthen this war may strengthen China's position if U.S. appears overstretched. So I think Xi will go into the summit feeling more stronger, and that gives Xi leverage on trade or maybe Taiwan issue. So it may give Beijing a confidence boost that make the trade talks more tougher for Trump. And I believe the war has offered Beijing an opportunity to position itself as a reliable and peace-loving alternative global leader when the Gulf countries and other European countries have grown increasingly worried of an unpredictable U.S. administration.
Well, a lot to watch in the days ahead as diplomacy unfolds. Thank you so much for your time and thoughts, Dr. Ching Lin, Research Fellow from Middle East Institute at the National University of Singapore. Now, in other news, Taiwan's opposition leader, Zheng Liwen, is calling for peace between China and Taiwan on the third day of her visit to mainland China, which she has described as, quote, peace mission.
在天空飞的应该是鸟，不是飞弹；在海里游的应该是鱼，不是军舰。人类的科技应该是为人类、为地球谋福祉。人类的科技不应该是自相残杀、毁灭生态。
Ms. Zheng is in China at the invitation of President Xi Jinping. She says her visit is aimed at easing tensions as Beijing steps up military pressure on the self-ruled island that it claims as its own. The visit so far has taken Ms. Zheng and her delegation to Nanjing and Shanghai. She's headed to Beijing next. But China has long refused to engage with Taiwan's Democratic Progressive Party, a stance that also extends to former leader Tsai Ing-wen and current President William Lai, both of whom Beijing has labeled as separatist. Mr. Lai's administration has urged Ms. Zheng to press China to halt its military pressure and to engage with Taiwan's democratically elected government. At home, the DPP and KMT have also been at odds over defense spending. Last year, Mr. Lai proposed $40 billion in additional defense funding to counter China. But Parliament, where the opposition holds a majority, is still debating the plan. KMT members, meantime, had skipped talks on the crucial budget, drawing criticism from ruling party members. Well, amid the impasse, U.S. Senator Jim Banks has called on the island to pass the budget, saying only that would signal Taiwan is serious about peace through strength. Shifting gears from domestic politics to foreign relations, China is set to welcome Vietnamese leader To Lam next week, where he will meet his Chinese counterpart Xi Jinping. Beijing says that the visit comes at the invitation of Mr. Xi and highlights the importance of bilateral ties.
中方期待通过此访，赓续两国传统友好，持续深化中越全面战略合作伙伴关系，推动构建更高水平、具有战略意义的中越命运共同体，共同促进世界社会主义事业发展，共同维护地区和世界的和平、稳定、繁荣。
Chinese state media say the four-day visit will begin on Tuesday and marks Mr. Lam's first foreign trip since he was elected state president this week. Mr. Xi earlier congratulated the Vietnamese leader, expressing readiness to work with him and described their countries as, quote, comrades plus brothers. Bilateral agreements covering infrastructure and other sectors are expected to be signed during the visit, reinforcing already robust economic ties. It's unclear if both sides will address areas of friction, such as the issue of competing claims over maritime boundaries in the South China Sea, which Vietnam refers to as the East Sea. In March, Hanoi lodged a complaint with Beijing after reports emerged on Chinese dredging activities in the area. Vietnam called it illegal and invalid foreign activities. Well, the Philippine Coast Guard has unveiled its first dedicated command center in the Spratly Island chain, a flashpoint site in the disputed South China Sea that saw repeated confrontations between Philippine and Chinese vessels. Manila says that the new headquarters on Pagasa Island, known as T2 in the Philippines, will have a permanently stationed ship and an unspecified number of response vessels and specialists. Works are underway to build a deeper port to accommodate the docking of Coast Guard vessels. While the island is home to about 400 Filipinos, mostly fishermen and their families. China has accused them of living there illegally. Well, the move is the latest by the Philippines to reinforce its claim to the disputed region, including plans reviewed last month to rename more than 100 island features in the Spratlys. In response, Beijing accused Manila of breaking international laws, threatening unspecified measures to protect its own claims. Well, coming up next on East Asia Tonight, running the extra mile. We delve into why more people in China are hitting the trails. It looks like trail running is rapidly gaining traction as a popular sport in China. And as the season begins this year, CNA's Crystal Chia catches up with some runners to find out more about its allure.
52-year-old Larry Xie has been trail running for about 10 years. He's raced around the world across different distances. Last year, he completed the Ultra Trail du Mont Blanc in France, enduring 41 hours to finish the 170-kilometer mountain ultramarathon, widely regarded as among the most competitive in the world.
因为越野跑这个东西可以接触大自然，然后的话呢，也不像跑马拉松那么累，因为你跑马拉松你一直要跑不能停。但是越野的跑的话，你累的时候你可以停下来走几步，上坡的时候可以看看风景，然后呢，我们也可以自己带点吃的东西啊，补给。我觉得这个贴近大自然，放松自己，因为大家工作都已经压力很大了，所以每周进个山，呼吸新鲜空气，对自己整个人的这个放松非常有帮助。
I joined Larry on this run at Tianmashan in Shanghai.
那这是我第一次接触这项运动，然后我们现在是要往下跑，那我应该注意点什么呢？
主要是3个点。第一个点就是我们的鞋一定要绑紧，因为你不绑紧的话，你在下坡的时候，你的脚会往前冲，这样的话鞋就会对你的脚趾产生冲击挤压，时间久了脚趾就会很痛。第二个点就是我们的核心一定要收紧，然后我们的脚步一定要快。 就是说，把自己想象成你是踩在那个火堆上的这种感觉，这样的话，你的频率就会快，下坡就会比较顺畅。第3点就是下坡的时候，我们的眼睛要看得远，你不能只看脚下一步，你可能要看到2、3步外你的落脚点，这样的话，你的下坡就很顺畅，不会很慢，一步一步，越慢其实越危险。我们现在来操练一下。
OK，
3、2、1 ，Go！ 好，我们现在跑台阶。跑台阶的话，要用小腿的肌肉，大腿抬起来，然后核心收紧的往上跑。
好，
走。
Trail running has been fast gaining traction in China, with many marathon runners turning to it. There are about 500 trail running events in China yearly, up from 65 in 2014.
那我们有注意到，现在越来越多人去接触越野跑这项运动，那你是怎么看这个趋势？
首先肯定是好事，因为越野跑这个东西在中国现在虽然已经发展了差不多也有小10年的时间了，但是放到全世界的这个范围来看，它还是一个新兴的一个项目。 一个活动，当然发展的过程当中，我们也要有一个正确的一个导向啊。第一个就是我觉得还是要环保， 因为其实大自然给到我们这样一个越野跑的一个环境是需要所有人去保护的。那么第二个呢，就是我觉得越野跑还是要有一个循序渐进的一个过程，因为现在有很多刚刚入门的这个小伙伴他看了一些介绍觉得越野跑很好玩啊，也不是那么的困难啊，反正也可以有东西吃啊，就盲目的就加入了，就报了一些超出自己能力范围的一些比赛。
Xiao Qiu is comparatively new to the sport. She never used to exercise. And then in just 5 months, she managed to finish a 35-kilometer race in Shenzhen. She trains throughout the week with weights, road running, and endurance training.
那为什么我会选择报名一场越野跑的赛事？是因为我在山里边，我是完全能够听见自己的声音，而且山里边的情况，就是你这一次能安全的完成35公里，并不代表你下一次还能安全的完成35公里。我希望大家就是不用圆满，只求尽兴。说实话，如果真的每一次训练都能100%的完成的话，就说明你的训练计划设定的太低了。所以说，完不成，失败才是常态。你要享受这一路上的无常，就是你不知道它会发生什么才是最有趣的。那选择越野跑不就是这样吗？不就是不知道它下1公里会发生什么，不知道下1秒的天气会发生什么？所以说这个才是运动的魅力。
UTMB Group is one of the world's largest trail running organizers. They have about 100,000 regular trail runners from China registered in their database, and estimate the total number to be around 300,000. In April, UTMB will add a new event to its lineup, the Ultra Trail Mogan in Deqing County, Zhejiang Province, bringing its total number of races in China to 5.
The community is very engaged. We can see it on WeChat, for instance. The number of conversations that we have with runners is enormous. And then there is the events themselves. The locations we are in China are amazing. I mean, would you go to Sichuan, to Fujian, to Guangdong? I mean, the territories and the landscapes are very different. So you can offer a very strong diversity, something that is very unique.
As modern-day city dwellers increasingly look to be in the outdoors, the trail running industry is expected to grow. But stakeholders say the number and capacity for racers will need to stabilize to ensure the sport stays sustainable in the long run. Crystal Chia, CNA, Shanghai.
I hope you've enjoyed this Thursday's edition of East Asia Tonight. Don't forget your headlines anytime at cna.asia. And you can also look us up on all our socials, including Facebook and YouTube. Thanks for watching. See you again tomorrow.